the floor.
Thank you very much for a very welcome and nice introduction. It makes me blush, almost. I have 10 to 15 minutes, so I'll speak at the very maximum until 10 past 4 on a variety of issues. As our chairman suggested, I'm involved in one or two areas of the law, and I also practice, and in fact there's a number of issues that have passed in the seminar here today, which I've worked on with clients. The health taxes that Alberto mentioned, voluntary agreements. I was the lead counsel, and I continue to be the lead counsel on a voluntary agreement at the European level, which is a very interesting experience, especially because it shows that it's very, very difficult to create what is one of the, or considered one of the flagships of European co-self-regulation. A very interesting experience, of which I hope to at some point write a book, although there are some confidentiality issues involved there. And I also work indeed on nanotechnology, which is the area of interest which I will talk about today. I shared, by the way, and it was flagged this morning in terms of data and assessments, I shared a frustrating view that particularly on the CESL, that the European Commission have completely abused, misused the data that was supposed to underlie the rationale for a CESL. And indeed, those of you who have seen perhaps 2 weeks ago the United Kingdom's assessment of the CESL have of course pinpointed that as well. And I think it's a shame because it sort of besmirks, if you like, a lot of those assessments which the Commission is using or is misusing. Anyway, I have a number of slides here which I suspect will be on the website at some point, or which will otherwise be distributed to you. There's way too many, and even in the normal timing of the seminar, I would have certainly not covered them all. So I will, I'm afraid, dip into a number of the slides, which may at some point mean that I will flick through slides quite quickly, but you'll have them in global after the seminar. So these are the issues that I will talk about a little bit more. I'll probably spend a lot of time on the conclusion and the 2 slides just before that. But first a few, perhaps very, very briefly, what nanotechnology actually is. It's an interesting sector because, of course, it's a fairly newish sector. Nanotechnology is basically the tiny scale of manipulation at the subatomic level. So it allows scientists, or scientists are able to manipulate cells, atoms and subatoms at a level which basically means that they tinker with the composition of material, and that gives it different physical, chemical and other characteristics. It allows for exciting applications in consumer electronics, in food, in medicine, in useless things as well, special tennis balls and so on, which one doesn't really need. But in terms of medicine, in terms of food, in terms of consumer protection as well, it's quite an interesting application. And one of the, in terms of regulating nanotechnology, nano, by the way, nano, those of you who are not familiar with it, the scale you have to imagine is, the typical example that's being given is that 1 nanometer is 1/80,000th the width of a human hair. And that's the sort of level, that's 1 nanometer. And most nano applications take place between more or less 4 and 5 and about 65, 70 nanometers. There's an awful lot of science being done at that sort of a level. So you can imagine the sort of scale that this happens. Now, I put up a banana there because we were talking yesterday, last night, predictably about the speech which Prime Minister Cameron would have given today had it not been for the unfortunate events in Algeria. And one of the things that we are saying is that if one talks about European integration in the UK, the example that always comes up is the size of bananas, right? Even when one talks to an informed person, for some reason or another, this regulation of banana sizes, or the non-existent regulation of banana sizes, is something that always crops up in the debate. It's like a red flag to a bull. Similarly, in nanotechnology and regulation of nanotechnology, I'll come back to this slide in a second. What happened in nanotechnology, the red flag to the bull there is biotech. And I'll go to this slide here. Biotech. when nanotechnology became increasingly available, industry appreciated that if they didn't roll out proactively a regulatory regime, then regulators would do it for them, and most probably in the European Union, the general public would get very concerned and might indeed reject nano as it did with GM. Right? And there were some early traces of that which indeed showed that that might be the case. Frankly, or typically, the general public doesn't really know about nanotechnology, but when you flag it with them, they get very concerned and they get very scared. And therefore, the reaction amongst industry was, if we don't ourselves regulate, and if, in other words, we repeat the mistake of GM regulation, trying to push commercial products through the throats of European consumers, then the sector will not fly. So we need to do two things. We need to, firstly, regulate ourselves in terms of the products that we ought to be developing, which is an interesting reflection or intuition amongst industry. Self-policing in terms of the products that they really would put on the market. And some early criticism that indeed the most obvious examples of nanotechnology initially were things like the tennis balls, the golf balls, and so on, fairly useless consumer products. And there was a consensus decision made by industry, let's develop those products which will have an immediate benefit to your average consumer, which, for instance, in developing countries might have an immediate impact on food and food distribution, or, for instance, which will help us develop renewable energy much more efficiently, which will help us develop batteries and therefore help in the stocking of energy and so on and so forth. So a self-policing in terms of the actual marketing and development of products was seen as being something which industry should do early on in the process. And secondly, very much the idea that if industry were to wait until until regulators, whether they were European regulators or American regulators or regulators elsewhere, would develop law themselves, then indeed things might be too late, because then there would be one or other scandal or one or other disaster with a nanotechnological application, which would mean that the industry would collapse. So better to regulate practically. And these were indeed the earliest stages, I'm talking sort of 2001, 2002, of looking into the regulatory framework for nanotechnology, when coalitions were being made. And I think I have a slide somewhere. Here we go. Perhaps the next slide. This slide, perhaps first. The Nano Risk Framework, which is a coalition between DuPont and Environmental Defense. So an environmental grouping and an industry leader who were thinking about what the framework should look like and how one could translate it into real guidelines for industry. And indeed also at the European level, firstly in the United Kingdom, a voluntary code for registration of nanomaterials, which was a complete failure. It was not followed at all, even by the sponsors, the industry sponsors, much to the frustration of one or two of the big players in the industry. And also at the European level, and this is a very interesting initiative, this Code of Conduct for Responsible Nanotechnologies Research, very interesting document, which tries to discipline scientists as to links to what I said earlier about self-restraint in terms of the products the kind of product that one develops. This one tries to restrain and discipline scientists using, amongst others, ethical principles. It's non-binding, therefore it had no real impact, or perhaps the causal relationship is not so clear, but certainly it had no real impact. But it has a number of issues in there which, especially to the American scientific community, seemed extremely alien. It talked about knowledge apartheid, for instance. It talked about making sure that whatever one develops serves developing countries just as well as developed countries. It talked about consumer benefit, about environmental benefit, and so on, which to many in the scientific community were just strange concepts to have in a code of research. Anyway, so a lot of hope to begin with. There's very much in the background this idea of we must regulate ourselves, otherwise regulators will do it for us and the whole thing will collapse. And then in comes the European Parliament. The European Parliament, and again I have a slide with, these I'll skip. This one is the slide I was looking for. The European Parliament saying, now hang on a little minute, we have lots of promise here. Nanotechnology is being heralded as the new, the next big thing. Lots of things are going to be solved, and indeed one or two things have been solved. through nanotechnology and continue to be exciting developments. But what about the regulatory framework in terms of consumer protection? For instance, nano silver or nano zinc in sunscreens, cosmetics. What about the environment, marine pollution, and so on? So we haven't really properly looked into those things, and therefore we should somehow have an active regulatory involvement. And the European Parliament insisting that it didn't buy the European Commission's approach that the regulatory framework was sufficient, and that if there were a need for adaptation, then one can do that incrementally. That was a Commission focus very early on. That was also the industry focus from the beginning. The European Parliament basically reversed that and said what we need in nanotechnology is a REACH-type scenario. No data, no market, which of course you can imagine in a precautionary context such as in nanotechnologies, where the science simply wasn't clear, where the science continues to be unclear, where one can't have long-term studies yet on the impact of some of these applications. That would have been, of course, dramatic had one indeed said no data, no market. If we don't have those studies, then you won't be able to market it. So that didn't in the end happen. But what did happen as a result of Parliament's involvement is indeed an increasing number of, if you like, anchors in specific legislation, including in REACH, including in the cosmetics, the new cosmetics regulation, including in the novel foods, the amended novel foods regulation, where specific provisions are being made for nanotechnology, all the time appreciating that indeed long-term scientific impact is still very fuzzy, and therefore certainly not the step which some in Parliament would have liked to have had, which would have been a moratorium on all nano applications. That indeed didn't happen, and that was, of course, also to the joy of the American industry, but also, for instance, of Chinese industry, where an awful lot of consumer products, nano-engineered teas, for instance, were being introduced, which certainly were not marketed in the European market. This is also a period where some mistrust started to creep in the coalition between both environmentalists and industry, but also between industry and regulators. And famously, in the cosmetics sector, a very open row between the Commission and the cosmetics industry, because the cosmetics industry were claiming that there was not a single cosmetic application in the European Union that had any nanotechnology in it, whilst everybody knew for sure that there were at least 80, 90 applications which certainly did have nano in them. And it was a kind of a bizarre, somehow a return by industry to those biotech days, a return to really retreating into the trenches, digging one's heels in, mistrusting activists, mistrusting the European Commission, and so on. And this is effectively where we are more or less now. Skipping a few slides, perhaps going to one of the things that I wanted to flag here, ORIS, of course, and the ORIS process. This, of course, is of increasing relevance in regulation. It means also that an increasing amount of private actors are being made subject to transparency requirements. The European Commission, which is in tobacco cases and tobacco industry, having an increasingly active transparency policy. So don't wait for people to ask access, but actually actively make that information available, even if it is emails between the Commission and the tobacco industry. Similarly, in the nanotechnology industry. Nano pointers, I think I've mentioned these. Yes, this was another thing which I wanted to mention, regulatory cooperation. Again, much because of biotech and because of the failure of US industry to convince the European audience that biotech was a great thing, the EU and the US fairly early on said we need to make sure that if we are going to develop something that we do it together, that we do through the appropriate international channels, including the OECD, ISO, and so on. That still works, but a concern, I would argue, there is that that process is indeed quite intransparent. And I remember at a fairly recent workshop, for instance, someone from DG Sanko who suggested that when someone asked about a specific nanotoxicity study that had come out in Nature Nanotechnology and said, look, what's your view on this, and is this really something we should be worried about? And the official concern said, I've talked about it with my US counterpart, and he's convinced me that there is nothing to worry about. Case closed. Now, that was meant to be reassuring. In fact, of course, it created a lot of unrest, because if regulation starts depending on whether an individual civil servant is convinced or not by his transatlantic or other counterpart, then I think it's very problematic, also under an AURUS scenario. So in terms of conclusions, the pitfalls, actually, perhaps it's a pity I can't. Let me just, in 15 seconds, tell you what I wanted to say here. New methods of regulation. One, I think, has to be cautious in heralding them too much. Why? Because most of the studies and views on new regulation exaggerate the dangers and the pitfalls of command and control, and make a caricature of some of the command and control techniques, which I think misrepresents some of that old regulatory framework, which includes legislation, directives, and so on. And on these two slides, I summarize some of those views, and most of those actually arise from my own practical experience. So in terms of conclusion, some of these apply to nanotechnology regulation specifically, and perhaps less to today's topic. I suppose the last point, though, does. I think it's a pity that this mistrust crept in, that, in other words, industry activists and regulators now are more back to a sort of general framework of everyone mistrusting each other a little bit, always assuming that the other one doesn't quite talk the truth. I think that's a concern, and it needs to be addressed. Focus as well, I think, is a very important element there, something which I hope to do some research on very soon, which is precisely to what degree the self-disciplining in terms of what product one develops has actually worked in the case of nanotechnology. As in many cases, the most important slide is the first and the last, so if you do have any issues you want to raise with me, there's a variety of channels to do so. Thank you.
Thank you.